Ever get that feeling like you're learning something, but it just won't stick? Like you cram for a test and then poof, it's gone.
Oh, yeah, totally. Happens all the time, right?
Oh, we're diving deep today into a study that looked at how middle schoolers learn history, specifically asking, does teamwork beat the traditional lecture?
This is cool stuff. The research comes from a paper called, get this, Team-Based Learning, Moderating Effects of Metacognitive Elaborative Rehearsal,
Whoa, wait, hold on.
and Middle School History Content Recall. It was published back in 2014 and has some super interesting insights.
Metacognitive elaborative what now?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, isn't it? Basically, it means thinking deeply about your own thinking, like actively engaging with the stuff you're trying to learn. But we'll get into that.
All right, so listener, our mission today is to unpack which teaching methods actually help students understand and remember history, especially these days where it's not just about spitting out facts, but also having those deeper comprehension and literacy skills.
Exactly, and with this research, the big question is this. How does a team-based learning approach, specifically one called PASI-T, which stands for Promoting Acceleration of Comprehension and Content Through Text,
Okay, EPCT, got it.
how does that affect the link between a student's own deep thinking and their ability to actually remember historical facts?
Not a small study either. This was 2 years of research with hundreds of 8th graders and multiple teachers in different school districts, all focusing on American history. So first things first, why even bother looking past the good old lecture? What's the issue with that classic approach?
We see lectures are often seen as super efficient, especially for prepping for standardized tests. You got to cover a lot of ground fast. But the research suggests it might not be the best way to build that deep understanding and critical literacy. The paper actually mentions studies from way back, like the early 90s, and even more recent ones that show just how common lecturing still is in history and science classes.
Yeah, it's the go-to for so many teachers. I mean, it feels like you're getting through the material.
Hmm.
But this paper points out there's not a lot of evidence that lectures alone really help students develop those literacy skills you need in a subject like history.
Mm.
And they cite research from the late 2000s and early 2010s on this. Just hearing it doesn't make it stick.
Right. It's like passively absorbing the information, but not truly engaging with it. The paper highlights a bunch of studies saying that teacher-centered lectures just aren't enough. You need students to grapple with the material, think critically, and actually use what they're learning.
So that's where team-based learning and this PACT model come in. What's the big idea behind it?
Well, the original concept of team-based learning has been around for a while, especially in higher education. It has a few core elements. Think about it. Diverse groups, assigned by the teacher, not just friends, individual accountability, so everyone's got to come prepared, incentives for teamwork, and then in-class activities where they actually apply what they've learned together.
So that's the general idea. How do they adapt this for middle school history with the PPCT model? What makes it unique?
So Vaughn and his colleagues took that basic framework and fine-tuned it to focus on how 8th graders specifically engage with historical texts. The PAPT model emphasizes critical thinking about history, really exchanging ideas within teams, backing up viewpoints with evidence from the sources, and then building knowledge through problem solving and discussions. It's about getting those hands dirty with the material, not just passively listening.
So there's some real structure to this. It's not just throwing kids into groups and saying, have at it.
Totally. The paper breaks PACT down into 5 key parts. First is what they call the comprehension canopy.
Comprehension canopy, okay.
Yeah, it's about setting the scene for the whole unit, getting those brains going. It starts by having students tap into whatever prior knowledge they have about the topic, and then gives them sort of overarching framework, a big juicy question to guide their learning.
So like a guiding question for the whole unit.
Exactly. The paper gives this great example. During the Gilded Age, how did the economic, political, and social landscape of America change? So everything they learn ties back to that central idea.
So they have a clear direction for their learning. What's the second piece of the PASI-T puzzle?
Next up, we have essential words and concepts. This one focuses on directly teaching and then revisiting those key vocabulary words that are super important for understanding the historical context. But it's not just about memorizing definitions. The students are expected to use those words in discussions and their written work.
Making it practical.
Exactly, like building a functional historical vocabulary.
Do they give any examples of the kinds of words or how these discussions might go?
Oh, yeah. For example, they have prompts like, what is one thing you would do for your family if you had greater prosperity? Or how is a social revolution different from a political revolution? So it's about making those connections, not just reciting definitions.
I like that, pushing them to think deeper. What's next in the PASI lineup?
All right, so the third component is critical reading. Here they use primary sources, which are those first-hand accounts from the time period, and secondary sources like textbooks, but with planned stopping points.
So it's not just reading straight through.
Nope, these pauses are meant to encourage students to discuss what they're reading and take notes. It forces them to actively engage with the text as they go.
Makes sense. So it's a more interactive way of reading. What comes after the critical reading?
So then we have TBL comprehension checks. Remember, TBL stands for team-based learning. These are quizzes, but with a twist. First, each student takes the quiz solo to make sure everyone is pulling their weight. Then, they retake the same quiz as a team.
Okay, so how does that team quiz work? Is it just everyone shouting out answers?
Not quite. They have to discuss each question together and find evidence from their readings and notes to support their answers. The goal is to reach a consensus based on that evidence. And get this, they get instant feedback using scratch-off cards.
Like a lottery ticket for learning.
Kinda. If they get the wrong answer, they gotta keep discussing and checking their evidence until they get it right. They can even challenge a question if they have strong evidence to back it up. Turns a regular old quiz into a learning experience.
I bet that keeps them on their toes. What's the last ingredient in the PASI-T mix?
And finally, we have TBL knowledge application. So at the end of a unit, the teams work together on an activity where they actually use what they've learned to solve a problem or make a decision.
So they're putting their knowledge to work.
You got it. And they have to back up their choices with evidence from the texts and their notes.
Do they have any examples of what this knowledge application activity might look like?
Oh yeah, in the paper they give a really cool example. The teams pretend to be an advisory committee to the president during the Gilded Age.
Wow, stepping back in time.
I know, right? Their task is to recommend whether the U.S. should limit immigration, and they have to provide reasons like economic, social, and political reasons. They have to really put everything they learn together to make a convincing case.
So PAGT sounds pretty hands-on and collaborative, a very different way to engage with history. Now, the study also talks about these concepts of levels of processing and elaborative rehearsal. Can you break down those psychology terms for us?
Sure, these come from the world of cognitive psychology and are all about how our brains store information. The levels of processing theory basically says the more deeply you think about something, the better you remember it later.
Okay, so the more brain power, the better the memory. But what does deep thinking actually mean in this context?
So they talk about a spectrum from shallow to deep processing. Shallow processing is surface level, like just repeating information without really understanding it, like memorizing dates without context. Deep processing is when you're actively engaging with the information, trying to understand its meaning, connecting it to other things, building mental models.
So it's about making those connections, right?
Yeah, totally. The more deeply you process something, the stronger the memory, and that's where elaboration comes in. It's about linking new information to stuff you already know, integrating it into your existing understanding, and thinking about the bigger picture.
So the more you elaborate, the better you remember. Now, this study dives into metacognitive elaborative rehearsal. What does that metacognitive part add to the mix?
Okay, so metacognition is basically thinking about your own thinking, becoming aware of how you learn and remember things. Metacognitive elaborative rehearsal, then, is when someone is intentionally and consciously trying to process information deeply. It's about reflecting on the meaning, connecting it to your existing knowledge, really wrestling with it mentally.
So it's a very deliberate effort to understand and connect with what you're learning. And this study suggested that PASI-T might actually reduce the need for that intense individual mental effort. How so?
Well, because PASI-T is all about that constant engagement, team discussions, problem solving, applying knowledge, it's thought that maybe it takes some of the burden off each individual student to come up with those elaborations on their own. The learning structure itself encourages that deep thinking and connecting.
Interesting. It's like the instruction itself helps facilitate the deep thinking process. So how did they test all of this? What was their research method?
Okay, so they used data from 2 school years as part of a bigger PASI-T project. In both years, they randomly assigned each teacher's classes to either the PASI-T treatment group or a traditional instruction comparison group. And this was within the same schools, same teachers to make things fair. The first year had a good number of classes in each group, and the second year was even bigger with hundreds of students in each. The content, American history, and the amount of teaching time was kept about the same for both groups, too.
Makes sense. How did they measure what the students were learning and if they were using those deeper thinking strategies?
So they used a few different measures. Before and after each unit, they gave students the Gates-Maginity reading comprehension test. This was to see if there were any pre-existing differences in reading ability. To see how much American history they learned, they used the Assessment of Social Studies Knowledge, or ASK, which was made specifically for this study. And to gauge metacognitive elaborative rehearsal, they used questions from the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire, MSLQ. It's a standard questionnaire where students self-report on how they learn.
Okay, lots of data. What did they find after 2 years of research?
So one of the first findings, and this might surprise you, is there wasn't a big difference in how much students in the PACT and traditional classrooms reported using metacognitive elaborative rehearsal. Both groups said they were doing a similar amount of that deeper thinking.
Interesting. So the type of instruction didn't seem to affect how much they said they were thinking deeply. But what about how that deep thinking translated into remembering the actual history?
Now here is where things get really interesting. They found that the relationship between self-reported elaborative rehearsal and their scores on the history test was much stronger for the PACT students. In both years of the study, the regression coefficients, which basically show how strongly one thing predicts another, were notably higher in the PACT group compared to the traditional instruction group.
So even though both groups said they were thinking deeply, the PACT kids were better at turning that thinking into actual knowledge.
Exactly. They also did some more complex analyses like structural equation modeling and something called individual parameter contribution regression to really dig into the data. While one of those analyses didn't reach full significance, the other showed a statistically significant interaction, meaning the PACT method itself was playing a key role in that improved memory.
So what does all this tell us about teaching and learning history? What's the big picture takeaway?
Well, this research really supports those theories we talked about earlier, the levels of processing and also cognitive load theory.
Okay, remind us about those again.
Sure, cognitive load theory basically says there's a limit to how much our brains can process at once. PACT, by keeping students actively engaged and giving them structured ways to elaborate and discuss, might be reducing what's called extraneous cognitive load. This is basically the mental effort that isn't directly related to learning the content itself.
So like mental clutter that gets in the way of the actual learning.
Yeah, exactly. So by minimizing that extraneous load, it might be freeing up mental space for deeper processing of the history itself.
Makes sense. Less mental clutter, more brain power for learning.
Right. This research also tells us more about how students think about learning different subjects, with what's called content-specific metacognition.
Content-specific metacognition. That's a mouthful.
I know, right? But it's basically understanding that how we approach learning might differ depending on the subject. The study references other research that found 8th graders may not naturally use elaborative rehearsal as much when learning history, perhaps relying more on summarizing instead. These findings support that idea and suggest that effective history instruction needs to guide and support those deeper connections between historical events.
Okay, so taking this out of the research world and into the classroom, what's the key message for teachers?
Well, it seems like team-based learning models like PACT have a real potential to boost both content recall, which is important for tests, and historical literacy, which is a broader educational goal. Often, these two are seen as competing, but this research suggests that a well-designed collaborative approach can address both. So even when students are already trying to think deeply, the way they learn in PACT makes a huge difference in how much they remember.
That's pretty powerful.
Yep.
The study also mentions that implementing this kind of active learning isn't always easy, does it?
Yeah, they do point out that PACT requires more from both teachers and students compared to lectures. More classroom management, facilitating discussions, and students taking more ownership of their learning. It's not the easy way out.
And like any research, there are limitations to this study to keep in mind.
Oh, absolutely. While one analysis showed that key interaction we talked about, another analysis, looking at the whole model, didn't reach the same level of statistical significance, which the researchers acknowledge. Also, they measured metacognitive elaborative rehearsal through self-reporting, which can be tricky. People aren't always accurate about their own learning processes. And the specific questions they used captured a pretty broad definition of elaborative rehearsal. They also didn't have data at the team level, which could have been even more insightful.
So to wrap things up for you, our listener, even though students in both traditional and PACT classrooms said they were using similar amounts of deep thinking strategies, those learning in the active and collaborative PACT environment were much better at actually remembering what they learned.
That's the core of it. It really highlights how important the learning environment and the way information is presented is to making those individual efforts more effective.
So here's a thought for you, listener. How might these findings apply to your own learning, whether it's something you're studying formally or even in your work life? Could more active engagement, discussion, and collaboration help you learn and remember better, even when you're already trying to think deeply?
It's a great question to consider. If you're curious to learn more about team-based learning, those theories we discussed, or the ins and outs of teaching and learning history, the paper we talked about today, Team-Based Learning, Moderating Effects of Metacognitive Elaborative Rehearsal and Middle School History Content Recall, goes into a lot more detail and has a bunch of other resources too.
Definitely worth checking out if you want to keep this deep dive going.